This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family.
She was the picture of perfection, every gesture rehearsed, every smile polished for the world to see. But behind that perfect composure, a storm was brewing. For years, Catherine carried the weight of expectations, traditions, and secrets that would break anyone else. Yet, she endured in silence. Until now, what the cameras never captured is the struggle that finally refused to stay hidden. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Beneath the glimmer of tiaras and the echo of royal processions, Catherine's world had become one of quiet endurance. Every engagement, every public appearance was a performance rehearsed to perfection. The world saw grace. They didn't see the shaking hands behind clasped smiles. They saw poise, not pressure. From the outside, she seemed untouchable, serene, radiant, adored. But behind palace doors, that composure began to fracture in ways the cameras could never catch. Each day was another test of her ability to hold herself together in a world that demanded nothing less than flawlessness. She had been trained for this, the unspoken art of silence. But silence, she was beginning to realize, could be both a shield and a sentence. During public appearances, those closest to her started noticing fleeting moments when her gaze would drift lost somewhere far away from the noise and flashes. It wasn't fatigue. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The weight of constant performance had begun to press against her very soul. There were whispers, too, faint but persistent. Palace aides mentioned a change in her demeanor, a subtle withdrawal cloaked in courtesy. She laughed a little less, spoke with measured restraint, and seemed almost haunted by the very perfection the public adored her for. Even her fashion choices, once symbols of effortless elegance, had become quiet signals of exhaustion. Everything about her screamed composure, yet everything within her whispered collapse. Behind the grand curtains of royal life, Catherine's struggles became invisible battles. Every smile demanded strength, every step, control. The pressure was relentless, and the crown she did not yet wear had already begun to weigh upon her spirit. In the corridors of Kensington and the gilded chambers of Windsor, staff members tiptoed around what they called her quiet days. They didn't know that those days were not about rest, they were about recovery. Moments to piece herself back together before facing the world again. Her silence was her strongest weapon, yet it became her most painful prison. There were times she wanted to scream to shatter the illusion that royalty meant peace. But she knew too well the consequences of breaking the facade. The monarchy, as old as time, thrived on silence. And Catherine, born an outsider, knew that speaking her truth could turn loyalty into betrayal. So she smiled, every day, every moment, for the cameras, for the family, for the story they wanted the world to believe. But those closest to her could sense a storm forming behind that calm. A storm that had nothing to do with politics or image. It was personal, emotional, human. It was the exhaustion of being both a woman and a symbol, a mother and a figurehead, a heart constantly hidden behind protocol. It was the weight of being perfect in a place where imperfection was treated as treason. And while the world watched her wave, her soul whispered for release. Each day felt like another step closer to the edge, another test of endurance in a kingdom built on appearances. The breaking point, however, would not come under flashing lights or before the public eye. No, it would begin quietly where she least expected it. Not in the throne room, not at a state banquet, not in the cold gaze of cameras, but the breaking point didn't arrive in public. It began in the one place Catherine thought she could still breathe, her own home. Behind Windsor's ancient walls, nothing remains secret for long. Even the smallest whisper carries through the halls like wind through keyholes. And lately, those whispers spoke of Catherine, of meetings behind closed doors. Strange notes passed through staff, and a growing fear that she was being watched not by enemies, but by her own family. Windsor Castle had always been a fortress of history, but for Catherine, it began to feel like a fortress of shadows. Each corridor seemed to hum with unseen ears, every conversation carefully measured, every glance weighed. Close aides who once greeted her warmly now spoke in hushed tones, their words clipped, their loyalty uncertain. The atmosphere had shifted. What once felt regal now felt restrained. Catherine had become both admired and observed, as if her every move carried an unspoken consequence. It began subtly. A misplaced note, a staff member reassigned without explanation, a message that never reached its recipient. The rhythm of daily life around her began to change. Small inconsistencies that only someone living within those walls could feel. Catherine sensed it, the invisible tightening of control. Her phone calls shortened, her calendar quietly adjusted without her approval. At first, she brushed it off as royal logistics, the endless machinery of protocol. But soon, the patterns became too precise, too intentional. Someone wasn't just watching her, they were managing her. It was a trusted friend, one of her oldest confidantes, who dared to say it aloud. Over tea one afternoon, behind the heavy velvet of a Windsor drawing room, that voice trembled with warning. "They're controlling the narrative," she whispered. "Not just in the papers, but inside these walls." Catherine had smiled politely, masking the alarm beneath her composure, but the words stayed with her. Controlling the narrative. It wasn't just about what the world saw, it was about what she believed. And from that day, even her own truth began to feel like something slipping through her fingers. The Queen Consort's involvement was never overt, never traceable. But Catherine noticed the quiet inquiries, the subtle checking of her movements, the soft questions asked of her staff under the guise of concern. Camilla's influence was old and deep, woven into every department and conversation. Catherine, younger and less politically rooted, felt herself surrounded by invisible threads she could neither see nor sever. Reports began surfacing, notes accidentally shared with press contacts. Details of her engagements mysteriously leaked before they were confirmed. She had trusted those closest to her, yet now she didn't know who among them might be the source. Her world, once filled with family laughter and purpose, began to feel colder. Evenings grew quieter, not because of peace, but because of distance. The laughter of her children echoed through rooms that otherwise felt hollow. Catherine found herself keeping thoughts to herself, phrases cut short, emotions swallowed. Each word she spoke carried weight, each silence more meaning than she intended. She began to feel that even her reflection was not her own, that her image, her story, her essence had become property of the institution she once served so loyally. But in that quiet isolation, she found one small act of defiance. Late at night, when the castle finally slept and only the ticking of distant clocks filled the air, Catherine turned to her journal. Hidden away behind nursery shelves and family albums, it became her refuge. In its pages, she could finally breathe. There, she recorded what could not be spoken aloud. The questions, the fears, the strange sense that she was being slowly erased. Each entry was written in trembling hands, not as confession, but as survival. Her journal was not a diary, it was evidence. A map of emotion and betrayal written in code only she understood. It was the one place she could reclaim her truth. From the whispering halls, each word became a shield against the growing coldness, a desperate attempt to remind herself of who she was beneath the crown's shadow. And though she could not yet know it, those words, those fragile fragments of her truth, would one day ignite something the palace had never prepared for. They would outlive the whispers, outlast the control, and expose what the walls of Windsor had worked so hard to conceal. And it was in those pages written in trembling hands that Catherine's truth first began to take shape. Hidden in plain sight among children's storybooks was Catherine's private escape, a journal that chronicled her fears, her doubts, and the truth about the pressure that nearly consumed her. It was never meant to be found, but someone did. And what they discovered would ripple through the entire monarchy. Tucked quietly behind rows of fairy tales and bedtime stories, the journal was her one forbidden freedom, a fragile collection of thoughts. Written when the palace slept and her mind refused to rest. Inside those worn pages, Catherine's truth lived in ink and tears. It was there she poured what she could never confess aloud. The suffocating loneliness of a gilded cage, the ache of a heart forced to appear unbreakable, and the quiet realization that even in the grandest palace in Britain, she had never felt more alone. The entries were raw, almost trembling with exhaustion. "I wake up every day," she wrote, "and put on my face before the mirror, not makeup, but armor. Smiles are easier than explanations." Her handwriting would shift between calm reflection and frantic urgency, the words of a woman balancing on the edge between grace and despair. There were passages describing days when her laughter felt forced, moments when she stood before cheering crowds and wondered if anyone truly saw her, or if they only saw the crown's projection of who she was meant to be. Between the lines, there were hints of darker forces at play. She mentioned gentle hands that guide but control. A cryptic reference, many later believed, pointed toward the quiet manipulation that had surrounded her life for years. Catherine had begun to notice the ways in which affection could be turned into leverage, kindness into strategy. Friends were chosen for her. Words were monitored. Even her gestures, how she waved, when she spoke, when she smiled, were subtly corrected until she no longer recognized herself in the reflection she offered the world. She confessed a growing fear of erasure, of being quietly replaced or rewritten out of the royal script altogether. "There are decisions being made without me," one entry revealed, "and I see my name fading in conversations that once needed me present. I feel it, like a shadow growing over my place in this family." The lines carried a tone of resignation, but also defiance. Catherine knew she was being cornered, and yet, beneath the despair, she left traces of quiet, rebellion. One page stood out, written in a shaking hand, the ink smudged by tears. It read, "The truth will surface through my absence." The meaning was unclear, even haunting. Some would later claim it was a warning, an acknowledgement that if she ever vanished from public life, the truth of why would not stay hidden for long. Others saw it as prophecy, written by a woman who understood the dangerous weight of her silence. No one knew when or how the journal was discovered. Some say a staff member stumbled upon it by accident while cleaning the nursery. Others whisper that it was deliberately found, retrieved by someone who knew exactly where to look. What is certain is that once its contents were seen, nothing remained the same. Its words, though private, carried an energy that reached beyond the pages. They exposed the emotional cost of loyalty, the invisible scars of duty, and the quiet disintegration of a woman the world believed unshakable. The journal didn't merely tell. For her story, it challenged the very narrative the monarchy had built around her. Every sentence was a confession wrapped in courage. Every page, a rebellion against silence. And when the truth of its existence began to circulate within palace walls, whispers turned into panic. For in a place that thrives on secrecy, Catherine had unknowingly created the most dangerous weapon of all, her own voice. The discovery didn't just expose her pain, it lit the fuse on a royal reckoning. There are days the palace remembers forever, moments when time itself seems to hold its breath. One morning, as dawn broke over Kensington, something changed. Doors stayed closed. Phones went unanswered. Staff whispered but dared not ask. And when the first news reached the king, his silence said more than words ever could. Something had happened to Catherine. It began quietly, without warning. The kind of morning that felt heavy before the sun had even risen. Within the palace, A strange order was issued, subtle, but absolute. Corridors were cleared, staff movements were restricted, conversations stopped the moment someone entered the room. No one knew why, but everyone felt it. The air had shifted. By mid-morning, the rhythm of royal life, usually precise and predictable, had come to an eerie halt. Even the sound of footsteps seemed forbidden. At 9 a.m., senior courtiers were summoned to an emergency meeting, the kind reserved for only the gravest matters. The king's secretary arrived first, pale and shaken. His message was short and cold. There will be no statements, no leaks, no press. Within minutes, every communication channel connected to Kensington was locked down. The press office, normally flooded with updates, polished images, and carefully worded remarks, was told to pause everything. Silence, one aide recalled later, was the only instruction we received. Outside, reporters sensed something was wrong. Regular engagements disappeared from the royal calendar. Prince William, whose schedule was usually public down to the minute, vanished without explanation. The palace refused comment. No appearances, no messages, no smiles for the cameras. Only absence. And behind that absence, a growing dread. Even senior members of the household were left guessing. Every inquiry met the same cold response. Her Royal Highness is resting. But no one believed it. By midday, whispers turned into fear. A discreet medical team arrived through a service entrance, rarely used except in emergencies. They carried no insignia, no formal escort, just urgency. Witnesses described the air as heavy, like mourning before a death had even been declared. The palace chapel bell, usually silent except on solemn occasions, was heard once that afternoon, though no one ever explained why. What was clear was this: Catherine was not seen, not heard, not even mentioned aloud in official circles. She had disappeared from her own world. Behind the marble walls and gilded staircases, panic grew. William's private secretary was seen leaving in tears. Courtiers huddled in private offices, scribbling notes and making hushed calls. The king himself remained locked in his study, refusing to speak to the press, even as global networks began demanding answers. Within 24 hours, a storm of speculation erupted outside the palace gates, but inside, the silence deepened. The crown, so often a symbol of control, now seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. But this was not the silence of death. It was the silence of revelation. Something inside Catherine had broken, something years in the making. Her struggle, hidden behind perfect smiles and flawless appearances, had finally reached its limit. This was not disappearance. It was collapse. The monarchy, built on image and endurance, had pushed one of its brightest lights past the brink. And while the world waited for an explanation, the truth was far darker than anyone dared imagine. But to understand why she broke, one must look at the war being waged behind gilded doors, one that was never meant to reach the public. In the royal family, battles aren't fought with swords. They're fought with silence, alliances, and carefully planted stories. What began as subtle rivalry between two women became an all-out power struggle within Windsor's walls. Catherine versus Camilla, the future versus the present. And at the heart of it, a throne that could only protect one. It began quietly, as most wars in Windsor do not with confrontation, but with whispers. Catherine, the symbol of renewal and grace, represented the monarchy's future, a modern reflection of what the crown could become. Camilla, on the other hand, embodied its survival, the embodiment of a system that refused to bow to change. Between them lay the king's trust and the power that came with it. For months, the tension simmered under carefully polished civility until one remark, one leak, one betrayal turned that unspoken rivalry into open frost. The first signs came through the press. Anonymous reports hinting at disagreements over roles began appearing in royal columns. Stories spun in headlines that seemed almost too calculated. Senior royal, struggling to adapt to internal changes. Sources suggest tension in royal hierarchy. The language was polite, but the message was clear. Someone was shaping the narrative, and it wasn't Catherine. Behind closed doors, she was advised to keep her distance, to remain silent while the tides shifted. But Catherine had learned the cost of silence once before. This time, she refused to bend. Her refusal to play by the old rules became her greatest offense. Catherine stopped deferring to outdated courtesies, questioned decisions made in her absence, and demanded to be heard in matters concerning the family's future. To those who saw her as merely an extension of her husband's destiny, this was unsettling. To Camilla, it was dangerous. The Queen Consort circle began pushing back, quietly, discreetly, leaking selective details of private moments, turning Catherine's confidence into ambition, her strength into defiance. Each story chipped away at her image, leaving behind an echo of doubt. Caught between loyalty to his wife and duty to the crown, King Charles tried to contain the storm. He had promised stability, not scandal. But even he could see the fractures spreading through the family's foundation. Private letters began to circulate among senior courtiers, letters that revealed emotional manipulation masked as counsel. "She must learn her place," one line read. Another urged the king to protect the institution above personal comfort. The message was unmistakable. Catherine's independence was now seen as a threat. Under this quiet siege, her strength began to falter. The sleepless nights returned, and the exhaustion that had once subsided began to resurface with vengeance. Insiders spoke of her eyes losing their light, of her presence dimming in meetings where she once commanded the room. She was fighting not one battle, but two, the one inside the palace and the one inside herself. The toll was visible to those who dared to look close enough. What the world perceived as poise was now survival, every smile an act of quiet rebellion. Yet, even in the depths of exhaustion, Catherine understood something others did not. This was not about position or privilege, it was about legacy. The struggle was no longer between women, it was between eras. The old guard clinging to control, and the new voice demanding evolution. Every glance, every silence between her and Camilla carried centuries of unresolved tension. The monarchy could only stretch so far before it broke. And while courtiers framed it as rivalry, Catherine saw through the illusion. This was not merely about power, it was about endurance. A test not just of her will, but of her purpose as the mother of the next generation. Because what she was truly protecting wasn't a title, it was her children's place. In a future she refused to let be written by those who thrived on shadows. But where others saw rivalry, Catherine saw something deeper. A test of endurance that would define not just her future, but her children's destiny. Amid the chaos, one voice reached through the noise, a quiet plea from the one person who understood her without words. It wasn't a husband, it wasn't a friend, it was her eldest child, who saw the toll long before the world did. What happened next, inside the nursery of Windsor, would shatter the illusion of a perfect royal family forever. It happened in a moment that should have been ordinary. Catherine had retreated to the nursery, seeking a brief escape from the chaos consuming the palace. The weight of weeks, months, perhaps years, pressed against her chest until the silence itself became unbearable. She sat among toys and storybooks, her polished composure cracking under the weight of everything she had tried to contain. Tears she had denied herself in public finally fell, unrestrained and human. She thought she was alone, but she wasn't. Her eldest child had entered quietly, drawn not by sound, but by instinct. What he saw was not the mother the world adored, the poised, graceful figure who always seemed in control, but a woman on the edge of breaking. For a moment, neither spoke. He simply stood there, his innocence meeting her pain. And in that stillness, Catherine realized something devastating. Her silence had not protected them. It had only taught them how to hide their own pain. She gathered him close, her trembling hands smoothing his hair, whispering words meant as comfort but sounding more like confession. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice betrayed her. But he knew. Children, especially those raised in the cold glow of duty, always know. He asked why everyone seemed so sad lately, why his father was away more, why. The halls felt quieter, heavier. Catherine could barely answer. She had built her life around the promise of shielding them from the storm, but now the storm had entered their home. William, caught between his role as a prince and his responsibility as a husband, was watching the same storm from a distance. He had been raised to believe that emotion was weakness, that composure was survival. But as Catherine unraveled before him, those lessons became chains. He wanted to help, but every decision seemed to pull him in opposite directions between the family he was born into and the one he had built. His silence, though born of confusion, deepened her isolation. The children, too young to understand but too perceptive to ignore, began to feel the fracture. They sensed tension in the smallest things, in hurried goodnights, in the long pauses between laughter. Catherine noticed their growing unease and realized she could no longer allow her pain to define their world. She needed to protect on them, even if that meant sacrificing her own comfort. Her resolve hardened. For them, she would endure anything. For them, she would step away from the noise. In that nursery, surrounded by the symbols of innocence she was desperate to preserve, Catherine made a choice that would change everything. She would no longer allow the palace's demands to dictate her existence. She would no longer measure her worth in smiles for the camera or perfect appearances for public consumption. She would choose peace not as surrender, but as survival. That choice was not an escape. It was an act of defiance. For the first time, she wasn't reacting to pain. She was reclaiming her life from it. The monarchy would interpret it as retreat. The press would call it withdrawal. But those who truly knew her would see it for what it was, a mother's final vow to protect her children from the world that had nearly broken her. And when she made that choice, she unknowingly unleashed a chain of events that would expose everything she had tried to hide. No one knows how it happened or who betrayed her. But one morning, a single line from Catherine's journal appeared on a private forum, igniting chaos across every royal department. The palace scrambled to contain it, but it was too late. Catherine's truth was out, and once the world saw it, there was no going back. It began with a sentence. Just a few words written in Catherine's hand, meant only for her eyes. "I am expected to endure quietly, even when I am breaking." It surfaced anonymously in an obscure online post, but within hours, screenshots spread like wildfire. Journalists verified the handwriting. Experts confirmed the phrasing matched her previous statements. And then came the headlines, each more shocking than the last. The world that had once adored her perfect composure now demanded to know why she had been pushed to this point. Inside the palace, chaos erupted. Phones rang without pause. Senior courtiers convened, emergency meetings to trace the source of the leak, but the damage was already irreversible. Every department went into lockdown. The communication office drafted denial after denial, each more desperate than the last. Behind closed doors, suspicion turned inward. Who had access? Who stood to gain from Catherine's pain becoming public? Slowly, all eyes began to turn toward one corner of the royal household, toward someone high-ranking enough to have both access and motive. The whispers pointed upward, toward a senior insider whose loyalty had long been questioned. Outside those walls, the story took on a life of its own. Catherine's words became a rallying cry. Global media transformed her into the symbol of quiet suffering, of duty turned into imprisonment. Social feeds overflowed with images of her past appearances, now reinterpreted as signs of distress the world had failed to see. Commentators labeled her the prisoner princess. Crowds gathered outside royal estates with flowers and handwritten notes reading, "Stay strong, Catherine." What had once been controlled became uncontrollable. The monarchy's carefully polished narrative was crumbling in real time. The palace tried to fight back. Within hours, an orchestrated spin campaign began. Anonymous sources claimed the quote had been taken out of context, that the entry was fabricated, that Catherine had merely been reflecting on her workload. But the tone of their denials only deepened the public's mistrust. The people had made up their minds, Catherine had suffered, and she had been silenced. The palace's attempt to protect its image only exposed its coldness. William's fury was unlike anything seen before. Those close to him spoke of shouting behind closed doors, of slammed doors, and accusations that rattled even the most seasoned staff. He demanded names, answers, accountability. For him, this was no longer a matter of reputation, it was betrayal. The leak wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was the exposure of pain he had failed to prevent. His wife's suffering was now public, dissected by strangers, and all because someone inside their own circle had turned against them. Even King Charles, often so composed, could not mask his regret. He penned a private letter to Catherine, part apology, part confession. In it, he admitted that the system he had sworn to preserve had failed her. "You have borne too much," he wrote, "and perhaps we asked you to bear what no one should." The letter was never meant for the world, but those who later heard of it said it marked the king's first acknowledgement that the monarchy's silence had come at too high a cost. The palace's corridors, once filled with order, now echoed with guilt. Every attempt to regain control only deepened the fracture between institution and family. The monarchy had always survived scandal, but this was different. This was personal. This was truth, written by one of their own and set free by an act of betrayal. And no amount of denial could silence it. But even as the palace fought to regain control, Catherine's absence spoke louder than any official statement ever could. Weeks later, she re-emerged not through royal gates or red carpets, but in silence. No official photographer, no rehearsed smile, just Catherine, walking alone, wearing the quiet strength of a woman who had faced her breaking point and survived. The monarchy expected her silence. Instead, she returned with something far more dangerous: her voice. Her return was not orchestrated by advisors or planned by press officers. It happened without warning, without ceremony, just an ordinary day that became extraordinary in an instant. The woman the world thought broken appeared again, not in the glittering halls of Windsor or Buckingham, but somewhere far more symbolic among the people. Witnesses described her presence as calm yet commanding, fragile yet fearless. It wasn't just her appearance that stunned the nation, it was what her presence meant. Against every rule of royal control, Catherine had chosen to reappear on her own terms. The press descended like a storm, desperate for a statement, a photo, a sign of submission. But there was none. Catherine said nothing. She offered no apology, no explanation, no justification for her absence. And yet, her silence roared louder than any official declaration. Every headline that morning carried the same unspoken message. She was back, and she was done being managed. The monarchy, accustomed to crafting narratives in its own image, suddenly found itself faced with a truth it could not edit. Catherine had reclaimed her identity. The choice of where she was first seen was no accident. It wasn't a palace balcony or a royal garden, it was a quiet community center once funded through one of her earliest charities. It was there, years ago, she had met mothers struggling under the weight of public expectation and private pain. To return, there now, unannounced, was both a statement and a challenge. The symbolism was clear. She was aligning herself not with the institution that had confined her, but with the people who had always understood her humanity. In the photographs that followed, grainy, hurried, and unapproved, she looked markedly different. There was no crown, no curated wardrobe, no public performance, only resolve. The world saw not a princess defined by duty, but a woman who had survived betrayal and risen from it stronger than before. It was as though Catherine had transformed her suffering into strength, her silence into resistance. And in that transformation, she became something the monarchy had never truly prepared for: unpredictable. The palace, blindsided, scrambled to reframe the moment. Statements were drafted and discarded, debates ensued over how to officially acknowledge her reappearance. But nothing they issued could match the authenticity of what had just occurred. For the first time in decades, the monarchy was reacting to her, not controlling her. Inside royal offices, it was whispered that Catherine's quiet return had disrupted the very hierarchy meant to contain her. Outside, she was hailed as something even greater, a figure of endurance, dignity, and truth. The public response was immediate and electric. Social media overflowed with admiration. Hashtags declaring her the real heart of the monarchy trended across continents. For many, she represented not just grace under pressure, but defiance, wrapped in gentleness, a reminder that strength need not shout to be heard. Supporters rallied behind her, while commentators began speaking of a shift in the crown's center of gravity. Catherine, without a word, had become the monarchy's moral compass. Yet beneath the public triumph, something deeper was stirring within her. This was no return to routine, no quiet resumption of royal duty. The ordeal had changed her. She had seen how easily truth could be buried, how power thrived on silence, and she would never allow that silence to rule her again. This was the beginning of something new, something the palace could neither predict nor contain. The whispers had already begun. She was crafting something, a vision, a set of principles that would soon challenge everything the monarchy stood for. And while her silence spoke volumes, it was what she did next that would redefine royal history. In the end, Catherine's greatest rebellion wasn't against a person, it was against the silence that nearly destroyed her. Her private struggle became a public awakening, forcing the monarchy to face the one thing it could never control: truth. She tried to stay strong, the world said, but they were wrong. She did stay strong, and in doing so, she changed the crown forever. What followed her return was not just recovery, it was transformation. Catherine began to live by a new code, one built on transparency, empathy, and quiet defiance. She, no longer sought perfection nor approval. Her every word, her every action began to carry the weight of truth, a truth that was raw, human, and fearless. For too long, the crown had demanded silence in the name of dignity. Catherine shattered that illusion. Her strength no longer came from obedience, but from authenticity. The world saw in her something it hadn't seen in royalty for generations: vulnerability without weakness, compassion without compromise. Her philosophy became known among close aides as the doctrine of strength. It was not a declaration written on paper, but a way of living, a reminder that endurance did not mean suppression, and that power was meaningless without heart. Under her influence, royal engagements took on a different tone. Conversations became less about ceremony, more about connection. Her speeches, though brief and infrequent, resonated deeply. Every sentence carried the voice of someone who had suffered, survived, and chosen to rise not in anger, but in grace. Public admiration grew into something larger, something almost spiritual. Crowds that once gathered out of curiosity now came with reverence. She had transcended image and become symbol of perseverance, of humanity, of hope within an institution built on restraint. The media, once her greatest tormentor, began to rewrite her story. The people's queen in waiting, they called her, a phrase that spread across continents. It wasn't a title bestowed by the monarchy, it was earned by millions who saw themselves in her struggle. Behind palace doors, even the walls seemed to soften. In time, there were quiet reconciliations. Charles, once torn between tradition and affection, came to understand the cost of what the system had taken from her. Their conversations, brief but sincere, began the slow mending of trust. William, too, found his strength through her clarity. Where once he had been a prince torn between duty and love, he now followed her example, learning that leadership wasn't control, it was compassion. The family, fractured by fear and silence, began to heal under the very woman who had once stood on the edge of breaking. Her influence reached further than anyone expected. Palace protocols subtly shifted small reforms designed to protect the mental and emotional well-being of those behind the crown. It was said that Catherine's ordeal became a quiet lesson for an ancient institution, that survival in the modern age demanded empathy, not indifference. And though she never sought credit, the effects of her courage rippled through every corridor of power. In her final reflections, she wrote, "Strength was never the absence of pain, it was the decision to face it and live anyway." Those words captured the essence of her legacy. Catherine's journey was not about perfection or power, it was about endurance born from truth. Her silence had once been her prison. Now, her voice was her crown. And through it, she gave others permission to speak, to feel, and to rise. And so, from behind the palace gates to the hearts of millions, her story became more than a struggle. It became a revolution, whispered through every crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.